I still remember the first time I stepped into my friend's house that evening. It wasn't the first time I'd been there, but for some reason, the air felt different that day, lighter, warmer, almost expectant. The living room was softly lit, the golden glow of the lamps catching on polished wood and the faint shimmer of framed photographs along the walls. Everything carried the feeling of a home that had been lived in with care. And then she appeared. My friend's mom. She moved into the room with that effortless grace only some people carry, the kind that makes you notice them without trying. Her hair was tied back loosely, strands framing her face in a way that seemed natural, not rehearsed. She was older, yes, but there was nothing tired about her presence. Instead, it was steady, quietly radiant, like a fire that burned not for attention, but because it couldn't help but burn. "Welcome," she said, her voice warm, low, carrying just the right weight of sincerity. She reached out, resting her hand lightly on my shoulder as she greeted me. It was nothing more than polite, or at least it should have been, but her touch lingered just a second too long, and in that extra heartbeat of time, I felt something I wasn't supposed to. Her fingers pressed gently, reassuring, yet my chest tightened as though she'd brushed against more than just my shoulder. The faint scent of jasmine clung to her, delicate and familiar, like it had been waiting in the air for me to notice. I smiled back politely, trying to steady myself, but when our eyes met, something flickered there. A warmth, a pause, a quiet acknowledgement neither of us said out loud. It would have been easy to dismiss, to tell myself I'd imagined it. But as the evening unfolded, I found myself noticing things I hadn't before. The way her laughter softened the room, the subtle care she put into everything she did, pouring tea, arranging plates, even the way she listened when someone spoke. She had the kind of attention that made you feel seen, as though every word you offered mattered. At one point, as I passed by her in the hallway, she brushed past me gently, excusing herself with a smile. The faintest graze of her arm against mine shouldn't have stayed with me, but it did. My skin hummed with the ghost of it, as though she'd left an imprint no one else could see. And maybe that was when I first realized this wasn't just me stepping into a friend's house. Something else was happening here, quiet and unspoken. Something I couldn't name, but I knew I wasn't imagining. By the end of the evening, when I left, I should have been thinking about the jokes my friend made or the stories we'd shared. But all I carried with me was the memory of her smile and the way her hand, just for a moment, had rested against me like it meant more than it should. The next time I saw her, it was supposed to be nothing special. Just another evening at my friend's house. Laughter, small talk, the usual. But I carried with me the memory of that first encounter. Her hand on my shoulder, her eyes that lingered just a little too long. And as fate would have it, that night the room seemed to guide us closer again. Dinner had just been set, and everyone was gathered around the table. The light was soft, golden from the overhead chandelier, and the quiet clinking of silverware filled the pauses between conversations. She sat opposite me, her posture straight, elegant without being rigid. Every time I looked up, it seemed her gaze had already been waiting for mine. She'd smile faintly, then return to pouring water or offering food, as if nothing had happened. But it wasn't nothing. Not to me. At one point, she reached across the table to pass me a dish. My friend was talking animatedly about something beside us, completely unaware. Her hand extended, the bowl balanced between her fingers. I reached out at the same moment to take it, and that's when it happened. Her fingers brushed against mine. Not clumsy, not accidental, deliberate. Her skin was warm, soft, steady. The graze of her hand lingered, sliding across my knuckles in a way that made time slow down. My pulse quickened instantly, my throat tightening as I tried to mask the sudden rush in my chest. I glanced up. She was watching me. Her eyes held mine, calm, unflinching, as though she wanted me to know this wasn't a mistake. And then, just as quickly, she looked away, retreating into polite conversation with the others. The moment was gone, invisible to everyone else at the table. But I felt it, deeply. I sat there, holding the dish, barely aware of what it was anymore. The warmth of her touch still clung to me, echoing in the space between my fingers. I kept replaying it in my head. The softness of her skin, the deliberate slowness, the unspoken question hidden in that simple gesture. As the meal went on, she carried herself with the same composure as always, laughing softly at jokes, asking questions with kindness. But underneath it, I noticed the tiniest shifts, the way her glance would meet mine across the table, then dart away just a little too quickly. The way she smoothed her hair behind her ear, almost nervously, though her voice never betrayed it. It was nothing anyone else would have noticed. But I did, and I couldn't stop wondering, why? Why me? Why that touch? By the time dinner ended, I was no longer just a guest in my friend's home. I was carrying a secret, a moment that belonged only to us, hidden in plain sight. And the truth was, I wasn't sure whether I was more excited or terrified, because deep down, I knew that brush of her hand had changed everything. After that evening, I couldn't stop noticing her, even when I wasn't there. It was as if her presence had etched itself into my mind. And yet, the moments I did spend around her were always charged in ways I couldn't name aloud. A few days later, I went over again, this time under the pretense of helping my friend with a small project in the living room. The room smelled faintly of her perfume, warm and comforting, like sunlit jasmine. She appeared from the kitchen, carrying a tray with glasses of water, and I realized I was holding my breath before she even spoke. "Here, you two might need these," she said softly, setting the glasses down. Her hand brushed mine again as she passed one to me, deliberately slow this time. The graze sent a shiver up my arm, and I had to resist glancing at her face too quickly, afraid of betraying the effect it had on me. We were close, yet not close, an invisible line humming between us. Every time our hands touched, it was a spark that didn't demand fire, but lingered, waiting. Later, she asked me to help with something small, a stack of books, a photo frame, anything that required us to lean toward each other. And with every movement, the brush of her arm against mine felt intentional, a quiet dance of proximity and restraint. My senses were on high alert. The warmth of her shoulder, the subtle curve of her wrist as she adjusted the stack, the faint scent of jasmine clinging to the fabric of her blouse. And then there were the looks. Oh, those fleeting, private glances that seemed impossible to ignore. When she thought I wasn't watching, she would study me briefly, her expression softening in ways that made my chest tighten. There was curiosity there, but also something else, a quiet awareness of the connection we were skirting around but not naming. I found myself laughing more at her jokes, even when they weren't that funny. And she laughed at mine, but there was a softness to it, a warmth that made the air between us feel lighter, yet charged. In the pauses of conversation, when no one else noticed, our hands would nearly touch again, and I would freeze, caught between the desire to draw closer and the fear of crossing a line we hadn't spoken about. Every brush, every glance, every shared smile was a tiny confession we didn't have the courage to voice. By the end of the evening, I left with a strange mixture of exhilaration and confusion. I was caught in a web of unspoken feelings, each thread a reminder that our connection was growing stronger, even if neither of us admitted it. And though I couldn't explain why, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Every time we were near, there was a pull. Quiet, unrelenting, and impossible to ignore. Something was building, something I both feared and longed for, and I had no idea where it would lead. After those subtle moments, the next few days were strangely quiet. I found myself replaying every brush of her hand, every glance, every faint smile, analyzing them as if decoding a secret language. But when I saw her again, something had shifted. There was a distance in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a hesitation that made my chest tighten. It happened when I arrived for another casual evening at my friend's house. She greeted me, of course, but her hand lingered on my shoulder for a fraction less than usual, her smile polite but contained. I noticed it immediately, a small, almost imperceptible retreat, but to me, it felt like an ocean between us. During the evening, I kept finding myself searching for her, noticing the smallest movements, the way she adjusted her hair, the way she laughed softly at my friend's jokes. I longed to reach out, to close that distance, but something in her posture told me to hold back. And so I did, though every instinct in me screamed otherwise. The tension became a quiet game of cat and mouse. In moments when our hands almost touched, a casual brush while reaching for something on the table, or the near alignment of our knees while sitting, time seemed to stretch, filled with unspoken words. I wanted to reach for her hand, to let her know I noticed, I understood. But each time, I hesitated, afraid of breaking the fragile balance. And I could sense her hesitation, too. She would glance at me when she thought I wasn't looking, her expression soft yet wary, a flicker of longing buried under restraint. There was something in the way she paused when I laughed, something almost apologetic in the tilt of her head, as though she were reminding herself of limits she didn't want to cross. I felt it in the silence between us, too. A quiet heaviness whenever we found ourselves alone in a room, the air thick with everything neither of us had dared to say. My heart wanted to reach for her, to bridge that space, but my mind warned me. She's older, this is complicated, the world would never understand. And yet, the pull persisted, stronger than my hesitation, weaving through every glance, every unspoken smile. By the end of the night, I left with a strange ache. I realized that the tension, the hesitance on both sides, was itself a kind of intimacy. The fact that we were both holding back, aware of the connection, but unwilling to break the rules, made everything we'd shared feel all the more precious. And as I walked home, I kept thinking about her, the warmth of her hand against mine, the flicker of her eyes, the quiet pull that made me ache without knowing why. The hesitation was not a wall. It was a test, a delicate dance, and I didn't yet know who would make the first move. That it was one of those quiet evenings where everything else seemed to fade away. My friend had gone out to run errands, leaving just the two of us in the living room. The soft glow of the lamps cast long, warm shadows across the furniture, and a faint scent of jasmine lingered in the air, wrapping around me like a memory I couldn't shake. She was sitting on the edge of the couch, a book in her hands, though she wasn't really reading. I could feel the unspoken tension in the space between us, thick and impossible to ignore. Every time our eyes met, a silent conversation passed, one of longing, hesitation, and curiosity. At one point, she reached over to hand me a cushion I had dropped. Our fingers met, and this time the touch was deliberate, slow, impossible to misread. Her hand lingered on mine, warm, steady, and I could feel the subtle pulse of her heartbeat beneath her skin. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Sorry, she murmured softly, her voice barely above the hum of the room. But there was no apology in her tone, only the faintest trace of acknowledgement that we were crossing an invisible line. We sat there for a long moment, our hands still touching. I felt the gentle pressure of her fingers, the light brush of her palm against mine, and my chest tightened as though I was holding my breath for both of us. The room around us seemed to disappear, leaving only the warmth of her presence and the quiet pull between us. She leaned slightly closer, her shoulder brushing mine. The sensation was electric in its subtlety, sending a shiver down my spine. I could smell the faint perfume clinging to her blouse, soft and comforting, and I realized I was acutely aware of every detail. The tilt of her head, the curve of her wrist, the way her eyes searched mine with unspoken questions. Neither of us spoke. Words weren't necessary. The air was heavy with everything we hadn't said, but both of us understood. I wanted to close the space between us, to let my fingers entwine with hers fully, to feel the warmth of her body closer still. But something held me back. She was older, more experienced, and I wasn't ready to overstep, even though my heart ached too. And yet, in that suspended moment, there was intimacy, a closeness that didn't require words or declarations. Our silent connection, the subtle contact, and the shared glances spoke volumes. The hesitation, the restraint, the careful navigation of boundaries, it all made the moment burn brighter. Finally, She withdrew her hand slowly, letting it rest on her lap, and I felt a pang of longing as the warmth faded. But the room still hummed with the energy between us. We both knew what had passed without saying it aloud, and I left that evening with my heart racing, haunted by the brush of her hand, the quiet nearness, and the knowledge that nothing would ever feel the same again. That a few days later, the air between us felt heavier than usual. Every glance, every brush of hands had left its mark, and the unspoken tension was no longer something we could ignore. That evening, I found myself at my friend's house once again, this time for a quiet cup of tea while my friend was out. The room was dimly lit, warm and intimate, the kind of space where honesty seemed inevitable. She was sitting near the window, her hands wrapped around a cup, the steam rising slowly and mingling with the soft glow of the lamp. I noticed the way her fingers trembled slightly, as though she had been holding back the same storm I had felt brewing inside me for days. I hesitated at first, unsure how to begin, until she spoke, her voice soft but deliberate. I shouldn't feel this way, she admitted, her gaze dropping to the cup in her hands. But I can't help it. Her words hung in the air, fragile yet powerful. My heart thudded painfully in response, but I found my voice. I know, I said, quietly, placing my cup on the table. I feel it too. Every time we touch, or even just look at each other, it's like I can't breathe. She looked up, eyes searching mine, vulnerability flickering in the warm glow. There was no shame, no guilt, only honesty. And for the first time, we weren't pretending. Slowly, I reached across the small table. Our fingers met, tentative at first, then more certain, entwining in a way that felt inevitable. I could feel the steady warmth of her hand, her pulse vibrating gently against mine. She didn't pull away. Instead, she closed the space, letting her palm rest fully in mine. Her eyes softened, glistening slightly in the light. I've been afraid, she whispered. Afraid of what this could mean, afraid of crossing a line. I know, I replied, my thumb brushing across the back of her hand. But maybe it's okay, if we're careful, if we're honest. And in that moment, something shifted. The hesitation, the restraint, the invisible walls we had built, each one melted under the weight of honesty and mutual understanding. She leaned closer, and I could feel the warmth of her cheek near my shoulder, a quiet acknowledgement of trust, a gesture that said more than words ever could. We stayed like that for a long time, simply holding hands, letting the silence speak. Every subtle touch, every breath shared across the narrow space between us, reinforced what had been building for weeks, a connection deeper than we had allowed ourselves to admit. For the first time, I felt the tension release entirely, not with passion, but with intimacy. Vulnerability had replaced hesitation, trust had replaced fear, and the unspoken bond between us became something tangible, something we could finally feel without guilt or doubt. By the end of the evening, there was no grand declaration, no dramatic gesture, just quiet, steady understanding. Our fingers remained entwined as we shared a simple, meaningful smile, both of us knowing that the breakthrough had changed everything. The days after our quiet breakthrough were different, not in loud or obvious ways, but in the small, subtle moments that carried a weight neither of us could ignore. Every glance now lingered a little longer, every touch held intention, and yet there was no rush, no need to force anything. We were learning to exist in the space between closeness and restraint, and it felt like home. One evening, I found myself at their house once again, the sun lowering in the sky and spilling gold through the windows. My friend was out, leaving us in the familiar quiet of the living room. She was arranging flowers in a vase, her movements graceful, deliberate, and I stood nearby, my fingers brushing against the edge of the table almost accidentally. She glanced up, and our eyes met. No words were needed. Slowly, she set the flowers down and came closer, her hand finding mine as naturally as if it had always been meant to. The warmth of her palm spread to my fingers, then to my wrist, and I felt that same quiet steadiness, the gentle rhythm of a heartbeat that had become mine to notice. We moved to the couch together, sitting side by side, close but not forced. Her shoulder brushed mine, and I leaned into the small space between us, feeling the comfort of her presence without needing to define it. It was calm, intimate, and safe, the kind of closeness that doesn't need words to mean everything. Her hand slipped into mine, fully this time, fingers entwined, thumb brushing softly along the back of my hand. I could feel her breathing even out, soft and steady, and I realized how much I had longed for this, just to be near her, to exist quietly together without chaos or expectation. She rested her cheek lightly against my shoulder, and for a moment, the world outside the room didn't exist. There was no judgment, no hesitation, just the slow, measured warmth of connection. I felt a smile creep across my face, small but genuine, as I responded with my own quiet gesture, tilting my head slightly, leaning into the gentle pressure of her cheek. We sat like that for some time, the room bathed in the soft glow of the evening light. There were no dramatic confessions, no desperate attempts to explain the way we felt. The intimacy was in the silence, in the lingering touches, in the comfort of knowing that we had crossed the threshold together, carefully and with understanding. Finally, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm glad we didn't rush." "Me too," I replied, squeezing her hand gently. "This feels right." And it did. Perfectly, naturally right. As I left that evening, her hand in mine, I realized that what we had was more than fleeting attraction. It was steady, warm, and enduring. A connection built on patience, honesty, and quiet understanding. And for the first time, I felt certain that this was only the beginning of something that could last, not because of words or gestures, but because of the moments between them, the soft touches, the lingering glances, and the unspoken promise of care. We had found our rhythm, our quiet intimacy, and it was enough. More than enough.